I can't be the only one who's pissed off at the failure of the RTS genre. I'm even more pissed off that I can't do anything about it. I'm a writer, and that means that my involvement will likely be very late into development, by which point I will have no say in anything. I also have a lot of ideas, which are a dime a dozen in game development. So I'm going to be posting this idea on the internet as part of an ongoing portfolio project that I hope might be able to help or enlighten someone in the process. A few months ago, Giant Grant Gaming released a take on why a lot of RTS games fail. Effectively, this came down to the genre focusing too heavily on competition and hardcore elements, because the most vocal members of the community were those competitive and hardcore players. The problem with Grant's analysis is that he assumes that the next best RTS title will be a AAA title. While this could be filled by Stormgate, I feel like it needs to cut out the Star Wars sequel bullshit. I don't have the social or economic capital to even attempt that. So instead, I'm going to be talking about a hypothetical indie RTS title that would probably be about $20 to $30 on Steam. I'm also skipping the campaign for now, mainly because I'm slowly working towards a Command & Conquer 4 rewrite. Therefore, I will mostly be trying to focus on the gameplay, as well as try to establish several other reasons why the genre is failing. I'll be covering 3 things in this video. First, I will try and simplify the engine concerns from a graphical and performance perspective. Second, I'll focus on what we actually do in the game, as well as how combat could play out. Lastly, I'll come up with 3 unique factions, as well as explain how to create a unit roster. Arguably one of the most frustrating parts about an RTS on the development side is the engine. Now, Grant covered this in his video as well, but as someone who has had a bit more of a peek under the hood, his just put more work into it basically means that he has no idea how it works. The core problem is that we're basically trying to jam rocks to a choke point and expecting things to run smoothly. Now, there are certain fixes that do work, such as stuff that's been outlined in the Ars Technica Tiberian Sun video, but we're still thinking of units as moving rocks, and giving exceptions to those rules. So, what about air units? Air units don't care about any of this, at all. What if, somehow, we just put a little bit of code in there suggesting that maybe mutalisks should be allowed to have a bit of personal space? Basically, instead of making all these land-based games where we squeeze tanks down a narrow alley, it'd probably be a lot cheaper engine-wise to do stuff in space or aerial combat. So let's try and figure out an RTS game with space or aerial combat. I've always loved the idea of a navy ever since I watched Gary Anderson's Stingray as a kid. RTS games have always tried to stretch into navies as well, but I don't think I've ever been happy with them. Supreme Commander comes close, but I still think it could be a bit more interesting. This idea in particular started out as a Waterworld post-climate change sort of game, but after playing Endless Space 2 for a while, I actually felt like putting this on a gas giant would be a bit more of a spectacle. Now, the core fantasy that RTS as a genre tries to emulate is that of total mobilization. You, as the player, control a nation or colony's economy in a time of crisis in order to make sure that your nation colony survives. The problem I see with most RTS games is that you don't have a reason to engage that threat. You can just chill in your base and build up a cool set of units and then send them at your opponents, and whoever wins, wins. Therefore, we need to establish some kind of objective that guides you and your opponent together. One of the core selling points of Battle Royale modes, for example, is that instead of running around like headless chickens in the map just trying to kill your enemies, you are also trying to avoid the wall of death that is corralling all the other players on the map towards a general direction. So we need a general goal that players will naturally flock towards. In an RTS game, players like having resources and getting bigger and better units. So let's have resources out on the map that are used for said bigger units. And using these bigger units, they can control even more of the map. The problem with this line of thinking is that when you get behind, you can't tech up to get out of the mess you're in. So let's have 2 resources in the game. One is sort of like minerals in StarCraft, in that they're just used for everything. And another resource like gas, which is used for teching up. Let's call this plentiful resource fuel. You're on a gas giant, after all. I've also been interested with this idea of upkeep personally. So let's have it so that these units that you build actually use fuel. This means that as you build any and all units, you're losing fuel income. At the same time, however, since you're on a gas giant, you can build as many gas refineries as you can fit on the map. You can have infinite income, but your cost will also increase as you build up your army to defend that, making your consumption just as important as your production. As the basic resource of the game, fuel is used to produce everything from fighters to destroyers to battleships, but just like minerals, it's valuable because it's plentiful and relatively defensible. The lower on the tech tree you are, the more defensible you can be, while in order to progress through the tech tree, you need exotics, which are harvested from gas giant fauna out on the map. Exotics come in 3 types: shoals, migrations, and leviathans. Shoals are stationary on the map and replenish over time, but they can be overexploited and then need to recover their numbers. Migrations are migrations, and can be harvested much faster than shoals. They cross from one side of the map to the other, and new migrations follow the same path every so often. These migrations can be hunted down, but sometimes you want that to be to your advantage. After all, your opponent also wants those exotics. Leviathans, you do not mess with Leviathans. You will need to be at least T3 or late T2 in order to take one down. Even then, their battle cries will alert everyone on the map that you're fighting them. Exotics are harvested by expedition barges, which are also responsible for building all your buildings, including your gas refineries. Since your barges are responsible for your production and your harvesting, losing them is pretty big, but they aren't defenseless. Barges and all structures have the equivalent of a GDI watchtower as point defense. They can deal with a bomber rush, but don't expect them to go up against a destroyer. That's most of the industry of the game covered. But before I go on to units and gameplay, I'd like to talk about another mechanic, which is fog of war and espionage. Fog of war, if I might be a bit of a stupid game designer here, is maybe a bit too binary. You've either scouted that the enemy has nukes and is producing mass ghosts, or you don't. And that's assuming players even scout, because they don't. So what I want to do is turn these things into mechanics. Because we're doing a naval RTS, then we've got to have submarines and torpedoes and sonar, right? Okay, so think of Terran sensor towers, except instead of constantly making you aware of where exactly the unit is, you have an expanding pulse ring that tries to detect the enemy. You might be able to see the size of the craft, but not the craft itself. Sonar is also effective at detecting submarines and torpedoes, which are an important T2 addition which allows you to siege in sort of like the mid-game. Torpedoes can be shot down with point defense, because there isn't any water in the way, and submarines aren't exactly the tankiest things in the world. But I have seen real-life scenarios where militaries actually fire tomahawk missiles to screen for fighters. Each of the factions will also be able to upgrade their torpedoes to improve their capabilities, such as railgun torpedoes which activate from further away. At T3, some units, such as the battleship, will have the range to attack targets outside visual range, which I'll call fog shooting. You also get ECM boats, which have much better sonar capabilities and can launch cheap probes to scout for the battleships. Fog shooting isn't always reliable because you're firing into fog, so it's not guaranteed to hit. So there'll also be an accuracy evasion mechanic that makes units miss, hit, or critically strike, making their damage ignore armor. This accuracy evasion is also the domain of upgrades and ECM boats, with each faction getting their own spells as well. That's sonar out of the way, so now let's talk about espionage. There are a lot of things you can't know just by looking at an enemy base. You can't always, for example, know exactly how well his economy is doing, especially when you're fighting to hold your own damn base. Thing is, this information is already available in the replay system. In StarCraft 2, for example, you have several menus which allow you to see what their income is, what upgrades they have or are getting, what they're producing, etc. This is kind of why StarCraft 2 players say to watch replays. because you get a lot more information that you actually don't have access to in-game. So my incredible, amazing idea is that you can build spy centers which make reports out of this information. Why hasn't anyone else figured this out? Now we get to talk about units and factions. Now, I'm going to be structuring this like StarCraft's original roster, i.e. 10 units split between 3 tiers with variations between the 3 factions. StarCraft is based on pulpy science fiction, including but not limited to aliens and Starship Troopers. In fact, there's actually a really interesting video on the topic of Starship Troopers that I'll put in the description, if you can stand the ramblings of a woke academic that unironically stems from him hating the Dutch.
There are only 2 things I can't stand in this world. People who are intolerant of other people's cultures, and the Dutch.
To be honest, as soon as I said 3 factions, I know that I'm going to get comparisons with StarCraft. The worst thing you can do when actually taking inspiration, however, is to deny that inspiration. Did Dawn of War 3 have similarities to StarCraft? Yes, but the fact that they denied it made the situation so much worse. So, in order to not end up with Protoss, Terran, and Zerg, we need to find a different core and toy around with it. Personally, I originally designed these factions after their preferred anti-air that I had experience with in Supreme Commander. At T1, you basically just have a gun. At T2 you have flak, and at T3 you have missiles. So now let's take this idea and start characterizing these into factions. Missiles are kind of an easy one. They are the tech faction, who are very precise in their movements, but can be overwhelmed. Therefore, they rely on a range advantage or something to be better than their opponents. Does this sound a bit like Eldar or Protoss? Yeah, we'll need to find something a bit better. One thing I've been personally interested in more recently has been the Adeptus Mechanicus, or this idea of an armed force of a machine-worshipping religion. That works. As for the gun faction, they kind of have a homebrew quality to them. Okay, not exactly, but they're very normal as a whole, if maybe a bit more aggressive and brawlish. The worst thing you can do here, in my opinion, is to turn them into Americans. Seriously, there's a reason why all the good science fiction out there has it so that the world's already been blown up or is no longer important or something. It'd be better to just have a different aesthetic here, something that stands out. Personally, I had an idea for this guy who liked the idea of Genghis Khan so much that he basically set up his own Khanate in space. That'd work, right? Flak kind of has this industrial quality to it. A critical mass that it must reach before it utterly rips everything apart. So, some kind of corporate dystopia, maybe? Borrowing from Star Wars, maybe they're all clones or something. Yeah, that works. So, now that we've characterized all the factions, let's return to the unit roster. So, let's establish a table of tiers 1, 2, and 3. We've already talked about some of the units that will be important to the game systems, so we also need to add them in as well. In Tech 1, we have the fighter and the bomber. In T2, we have the submarine. In T3, we have the battleship and the ECM boat. This only takes up 5 slots of the 10 that we have. So now we can start adding a few more ship classes in there to sort of like round things out. So in T1, we've got the fighter, the bomber, and the gunship. In T2, we have the submarine, the destroyer, and the flak boat. And in T3, we have the battleship, the ECM boat, and the cruiser. So, to explain where each of these 4 new ship classes line up, destroyers are fast and effective ships that can deal with most threats and are for people who want more of a T2 fleet. Flak boats are important for players who don't like playing with fighters. Cruisers are very effective against all T2 ships, but they lack the siege potential of battleships. Gunships are a T1.5 unit that straddles the line between fighter and destroyer. And then we have a final slot that we can leave open for each faction. The question now becomes, how do we flesh out these unit rosters? Well, the first thing we have to understand is that we need to keep the root of the faction intact. Let's say that I wanted a carrier in the game. Which faction would feel most at home with that? Probably all of them, to be honest. But what if we wanted to carry a T2? How does that design ripple through a faction? Well, first of all, their T1 fighter would need to be different from the others because you'd just be building carriers instead of fighters. Therefore, this faction's T1 fighter would have to be fundamentally different from a carrier fighter, for example. I can think of it as kind of an ASF with missiles that could do high-speed run-bys on enemy fighters. This would then suggest that this carrier would belong to our tech faction, because that fits in with the identity of missiles. However, because missiles could also function as bombs, this ASF would also infringe on the bomber identity, which would mean that we'd need to have something else instead of just maybe a bomber. For example, a torpedo bomber. And then this also infringes on the idea of a submarine also having torpedoes, so you need to have something else instead, and it goes on and on and on. So instead of chasing this idea down the rabbit hole, it might be a better idea to just combine the ASF and bomber idea together, and say that it's another hole to be filled in the design space. For example, we could split the gunship into two, having a longer range version and another version being a bit more of a brawler unit sort of thing. And that's all I want to cover in this video because it's getting long enough already, and I finished writing this on the back end of COVID, which was not very nice. I'm not expecting any kind of charity with some angelic developer coming to swoop in and spend their valuable time turning this into a game, but like, can we be friends or something? I guess?